Hey guys, I'm Michael Braden. In this video, we're going to talk all about strings and cables. What's their purpose? How often should we replace our strings and cables? Custom strings versus factory strings. The material that I use and why. Does the direction the string is twisted matter? And how the direction the string is twisted might affect something else in archery. So y'all sit tight, enjoy the video. I often tell my students that we, the archer, are 95% of the reason that arrow lands where it lands, and the equipment is 5%. And I say that to keep the perspective on the more important factor in the equation. Our form, our shot sequence, our sight picture, and our shot execution is going to make way more difference in that point of impact than the equipment. But there's a lot rolled into the 5% that is the equipment, and the strings are no exception. What is their job? First off, I'm going to say the job is to transfer the stored energy that's in this bow and transfer it into that arrow. It's also a place that we nock our arrow that's going to launch that arrow. But also the manufacturer designed this bow to be a certain geometry, a certain axle-to-axle length, and a certain brace height. They also designed this bow with a certain cam system. And this cam was designed to be in a certain orientation, or what I would call cam timing. And once that cam is in the right orientation or timing, then it's going to give the proper poundage, the proper draw length, the proper let off. Also, it's going to give them the draw force curve that manufacturer was looking for in that cam. So I believe it's important for us to keep a log on every bow that we have with regards to the factory geometry and maybe the factory string and cable links so that we know where this bow was supposed to start. Do I alter those specs occasionally? Absolutely, and honestly, quite often, because I might need the bow to do a certain thing. But I need to know that everything I do to my string and cables or everything I do to a bow affects 5 to 10 other things. So I need to know what those things might be. For example, let's say I'm in between mod positions on my draw length. And having my draw length right is super critical to me, so I need to do something to make my draw length right. I can either put my mod in a longer draw position and shorten it. How would I do that? First thing I'm typically going to do is twist up the string. What happens if I twist up this bowstring on my bow? It's going to shorten that string as I twist it, and if I shorten the string, it's going to shorten my draw. It's going to kill poundage. It's also going to shorten the valley of the bow. And the valley is when we come to full draw and we're sitting here, that's what we would call the valley. And that's also represents the holding weight or how much let off a cam has. So if I shorten the draw, if I twist up that string, it's going to shorten that valley. And if I go too far, then it's going to get that cam to the point it's wanting to take off on me. And that makes my valley feel a little snatchy, or it makes it feel like the bow's trying to tug out of my hand. And maybe I don't like that. So what I could do is then come back and put my mod position in the shorter draw length position and lengthen the draw. And how would I lengthen the draw? I would typically go to twisting up the cables. What happens if I twist up the cables? It shortens these cables. It also lengthens my draw, increases poundage, and it also makes that valley feel a little bit longer, and it might actually pound for pound lower my holding weight. So I just need to keep in mind that everything I do to my bow is going to affect other things. So then maybe I come back after I'm done and look and say, my bow's not spec now. Maybe my axle-to-axle is not perfect, or my brace height isn't perfect, or my cam timing isn't perfect. But if it serves my purpose, and that purpose is more important than the cam being absolutely perfect in spec, then it's the lesser of the evils for sure. So how often should we replace the strings and cables on our bow? I believe it's good practice to replace your strings and cables once a year. It's relatively inexpensive insurance to make sure your strings and cables don't fail. And when I say fail, I mean break. Because if your strings or cables break, there's a high probability it's going to take out your cams, and there's a chance it could take out the limbs as well. And no bow manufacturer is going to warranty the strings and cables or the damage caused by string failure. And the majority of string failure is due to human error. Most of that is due to a dry fire. Maybe you just forgot to load the arrow on the string. Maybe you loaded it on the string, but for some reason during the draw cycle, the nock came off the string. Or maybe it was a damaged nock. It got hit on a previous end. You loaded your arrow, didn't recognize there was damage to the nock, and when you shot your bow, the arrow didn't absorb the stored energy in that bow. And that stored energy's got to go somewhere, and it needs the weight of that arrow to absorb that energy. And if not, there's a high probability those strings are going to fail or break. Another possible failure is that when we draw our bow back, maybe with our fingers, or maybe when we go to let down, we really kind of torque that riser a little bit too much, causing that string to what we call derail. It come out of the track of the cam, causing it to derail. And oftentimes that's going to cause some damage and possibly string failure that could lead to other damage. So I believe it's a good practice for us to replace our strings and cables once a year, maybe every 2 years if you're not putting a lot of arrows on a given bow. Let's talk about the difference between custom strings versus factory strings. Early in my archery career, it did not take me long to realize the factory strings were not very well made. And they weren't because there was a lot of creep in a string. Now, I use the term creep. Creep for me means that string gets longer and doesn't come back. Oftentimes we use the term stretch. Hey, my string stretched, my cable stretched. But for me, I look at stretch like a rubber band. A rubber band stretches, but then comes back. Creep for me means that string gets longer and doesn't come back. And how can that affect me? If my string gets longer, well, it's going to increase the draw length of my bow, and it's also going to increase the speed of my bow. Well, that's going to change my pin marks, and obviously it's going to move my point of impact. So it's important that my string stay within spec as long as possible. Now the cables. In today's world, most of our cam systems are more like 2 cams versus 1 cams, but it really doesn't matter. If the cables creep independently of each other, well, then my cams are going to get out of sync. And if my cams get out of sync, well, that's going to affect the wall of the bow, how the valley feels once I get to full draw, and it's also going to affect how the arrow comes off the string or out of the bow, basically talking about the tune of my arrow. It's going to really dramatically impact how my arrow flies. So it's very critical for me as a shooter that my strings and cables do their part to help me keep my bow as tuned as long as possible. Should we check it once in a while? Absolutely. But I need to know that bow is going to stay as close to tuned as possible for as long as possible. Now, full disclosure, I've been shooting for threads bowstrings for quite some time. I've found zero fault in the making of their strings, and Jerry and Margie Carter are super awesome people. I've really enjoyed my relationship with them over the last few years, so I'd really recommend them. So now I want to talk very basic, very generic about how a string is made. This string jig could be used to do everything that you need. It can be set to lay up my string. It also is a stretcher. It has a spring on this end that I can put this string under a certain load for a certain period of time. But most custom string makers out there have much different machines and processes that they're potentially going to put that string through. But just a really generic how a string is made. The strand of material is going to come on a spool. Now, am I going to use one color of string? Am I going to use 2 colors of string? Or am I going to put a pinstripe in that string? So I need to obviously have that determined before I make my string. So once your jig is set, you're going to take this end loop, you're going to then tie it off, and then you're going to wrap the string around this peg however many times you need, however many strands of material you use. Currently with the BCY 452X material, I'm running 24 strands on both my strings and my cables. So, and if I'm going to use one color of string, I'm going to lay that thing up until I get 24 strands of material. Then the other end of this is going to get tied off, okay? And then what you have is 2 halves of material. Then with this second little wing and this end right here, I'm going to open up the end of this material. And what this exposes now is the center, if you will, of this material. And this is going to make my end loop. And I'm a super big fan of my end loops being served because it helps protect the individual strands of material as it goes around the peg that's on that cam. There might be a burr on that peg that might damage my individual strand of material. And if the individual strands of material get damaged, well, then there's more load on the other strands and it could cause a premature failure, okay? So I'm a super big fan of this end loop being served. Plus, it creates some unity in these fibers here. If I'm going to take a string off and put a twist in a string or a cable, I can pull that bundle that's served off of that peg easily, put my twist in it, and put it right back on. So I'm a super big fan of this end loop being served. But obviously it takes more time to do so. And some factory string companies out there don't serve that end loop. Then the string maker is either going to take this string that's basically in 2 halves, and they're going to put it on either a stretcher or they're going to put it on this automated machine that's going to put their end servings on. But if the string maker is going to put it on a stretcher, they're going to put it under a certain load for a certain period of time to take all that initial creep out of that strand of fiber material itself. Okay, super important, and that's the bulk of what a custom string maker is going to do. He's going to serve these end loops. He's going to put that string through some different processes to take the bulk of the creep out of that string. Some may kind of burnish that string so that they take some excess wax out of the string. They might put it under heat because heat will cause that string to creep. But different string makers are going to put that string through some different processes to take the bulk of that initial creep out, okay? So once that string has been stretched, they're then going to put it on this automated machine. And the automated machine is really cool because they can program it to put it under a certain load. They can program the amount of twists per inch that they want to put in that string. They can also twist it a certain direction, whether it's clockwise or counterclockwise. And then once that string is under load, they're going to come in and put these end servings on. And the end serving is what's going to wrap around the track of that cam. So the string makers know what the specs need to be, whether they're building a string or a cable. They know how long this serving needs to be to protect that string as it wraps around the cam. So it's very important that this end serving be put under load, and then that string machine also spins that string so that whenever they're putting their serving on, they can control the speed of that, and they can really make sure that that serving's put on super tight. It also helps prevent that serving from separating, because if that end serving were to separate as it rolls around the track of that cam, that's going to expose the fibers. And if the fibers get damaged, well, then we can look at a premature failure. So it's important that we protect those fibers as much as possible. So then once that string maker finishes that string, sends it to you, I'm confident that my strings are going to be to spec and the bulk of that creep is taken out of those strings. Now that you have a basic understanding of how a string is made, I want to talk a little bit about the different spools of material, maybe even the different colors. I personally have always shot a single colored string. As I showed you how a string was laid up, they take this spool and there's 2 loose ends that are tied off. Well, if I grab another color and add another color of string, well, then I'm going to have 4 loose ends. And if I add a pinstripe or an accent color, well, now I've got 6 loose ends. So just me, more mentally than anything, I believe that single colored string is just a little more consistent and a little more stable for me. Now, the difference between The fluorescent strings and maybe the others, generally speaking, the fluorescent string has a higher wax content to it. So if you made up a 24 strand string of a fluorescent color and a non-fluorescent color and served it with the same size center serving, I guarantee you your knock is going to fit tighter on that fluorescent string. So I've always kind of tended to stay away from the fluorescent colors for that reason. Now I want to take a moment to talk about the actual fiber or the strand of material that I use. I've shot 4 BCY for many years and I choose the 452X material. I have found this blend of material to be very stable with regards to durability, wear and tear, and it seems to be a really good balance of stretch versus creep. And there's two terms that we use. Oftentimes we say, hey, my string's stretched. What does that mean? To me, I look at stretch like a rubber band. A rubber band stretches, but then it comes back. And the string has a little bit of that elasticity effect to it, and that helps absorb a little shock and vibration and makes the shot just a little bit softer. But creep is really the term that we should use with regards to my string getting longer and not coming back. So the reality is our strings and cables creep, but don't come back. So I have found the 452X material to be very stable with regards to that. So if we were to look at the actual strand of material that we use, that is 452X, and we were to break apart the very end of this strand of material, you would see that it's made up of some very small hair-like fibers. And these fibers are the blend of material that creates 452X. But in the manufacturing process, they have to do something with these little hair-like fibers to give them integrity and strength. So they have to put some twist in it. So the material that we can purchase today from BCY is called S-twist. And S-twist means that that strand of material is made with a clockwise rotation. So now when we twist our string, clockwise or counterclockwise, does it matter? When talking about the direction the string is twisted, does it matter? I'm going to go back in time for a moment and I'm going to introduce to you Jay James. Really good friend of mine, was a pro shooter for many years. He also made his own bowstrings, and I shot his strings for several years. Him and I used to bounce ideas off of each other. I want to think of myself as a method to the madness guy, and I'm always asking my students why. And I say why because I want them to understand why they do what they do and why you get certain results based on what you do. But I also want to ask that about my equipment. What's its purpose? What's it for? What matters to me? And many, many years ago, we realized that a bare shaft would cast coming off the string. So an arrow with no fletching on it would cast a certain direction. And there was a little bit of talk about it, but nobody really came to the conclusion as to why. So him and I did a lot of testing and trying to figure out what it was. And we came to the conclusion that it was the direction that the string was twisted. Okay, so a clockwise twisted string would cause a bare shaft to cast counterclockwise or left, and vice versa. A string with a counterclockwise rotation would cause that bare shaft to cast clockwise. Now, that's assuming that the knock is somewhat snug on the serving. If the knock was loose on the serving, then there was no telling which direction that was going to go. But I kind of visualize a spring, a coiled spring. And whenever that, let's say you put that arrow on a coiled spring, when we shoot our bow, the instant that arrow is leaving the string, that string is super tight. And you can kind of see that coil uncoiling. And so as that knock is leaving the string, it creates this cast one way or the other. Okay, so there was no question that it was the direction the string was twisted causes a bare shaft to cast one way or the other. So we thought about that for a little while, and then we got to thinking about, does it matter the direction that the string is twisted? Now, Jay, in his string making early on, prior to this, he actually made his strings with a counterclockwise twist. There was no rational reason as to why he did. He saw some other strings that were made that way and said, hey, they're doing it this way. Let me go ahead and do it that same way so that people don't look at his strings differently, let's say. All right. But he didn't really know, does it matter or not? All right. So then we come to the actual fiber, the strand of material. The strand of material, the BCY S twist that we can purchase today, it's made with a clockwise rotation. So we thought, does it matter? So what Jay did, he did some testing and he laid up 2 strings, the exact same length. He twisted one of them clockwise and served it appropriately for a clockwise twisted string. Then he laid up one that was counterclockwise, the same way that he had been making his strings, and served it appropriately for a counterclockwise twist. And what he saw was the clockwise twisted string that was the same direction as the fiber strand made up shorter than his string that was twisted counterclockwise, the opposite direction of the fiber, made up longer. And we thought, okay, that's interesting. But then he took both of those strings and put them on a stretcher. And he found that the string that was twisted counterclockwise crept more. Okay, so we came to the conclusion based on that testing that it does matter. It's one thing to say, okay, what's happening? If we take that string and we twist it counterclockwise, we're basically taking some of the twist out of this individual strand of material. Just like when you're taking your string, if you want to shorten your draw, you put twist in that string and it makes it shorter. If you want to lengthen your draw, you take twist out of that string to make it longer. So, okay, we're basically, by taking these bundle of strands of string and twisting them counterclockwise, we're taking a few twists out of this fiber, okay? But that would be one thing to say, okay, it really doesn't matter. It's just taking some of those strands out, and the string that's twisted counterclockwise is going to make up a little bit longer. But the fact that it crept more under load, for me, that tells me that it's doing a little bit more than just taking a few twists out of that string. Whether it's losing a little bit of the strength and integrity of that individual strand of material or not. And Jay had to end up remaking his strings, and he went to a clockwise rotation because him and I came to the conclusion that it does matter. I personally believe that every string that's made with BCY S twist should be made with a clockwise rotation to minimize the creep. I wanted to talk for a second about this hunting bow that I'm fixing to replace the strings and cables on. Now, this hunting bow is at least 2 years old, and this also rarely ever happens for me. Normally, one of the first things I do when I get a bow is I put new custom strings and cables on it. But this bow, I got it right in the middle of hunting season. I wanted to go ahead and hunt with it, so I set the bow up, I tuned it, got some marks for it, set my sights, and then I went hunting that season. And because I'm a competitive archer and I'm shooting all the time and I have multiple competition bows, I spend the bulk of my time during the year shooting my competition bows. So I didn't put a whole lot of arrows on this bow after that season and then going into the following season. I haven't been hunting a whole lot. So this bow really never got a whole lot of arrows on it, but I did hunt with it for the last couple of seasons. In fact, I shot a doe with it this last fall. And so as I was getting ready to replace the strings and cables, I was getting ready to take all my measurements that I would before I replace them so that I can put it back where it was. And I wanted to show you something because these were the original factory strings that came on this bow. And they're also strings that are made with a counterclockwise twist direction, which is opposite of the direction the fiber material is twisted. So as I was measuring that, I came across the axle to axle length. So how I measure axle to axle is I hang the end of my tape on the top of one axle and I measure to the top of the opposite axle. And that gives me a true center to center, axle to axle length. And as you can see, this bow measures 35 7/16, and it was designed to be 35 inches. One of the first things I measure and put on my log is the axle to axle length. The axle to axle is a really good measurement to keep an eye on your bow, because it's a very precise unit of measure to be able to recognize versus brace height. Because with today's bows of being parallel limbs, the axle to axle length can change quite a bit and it not visibly change the brace height. So the brace height is something that you should put in your log, but it's not the most accurate unit of measure. I think axle to axle is way more important to that. But I wanted to show you guys that these strings and cables have crept 7/16 of an inch, and that these strings were the factory strings, and they are strings that are made with a counterclockwise rotation. So is that a factor in this? I personally believe it is. I want to recap a little bit on what happens when. What happens when my strings and cables creep? Well, how do I know if they've crept? Well, I've got to do my due diligence and make sure when I'm first building this bow, what is the order of importance to me? For me, it's going to be draw length first. It is critical that my draw length be as close to perfect as possible for me to be the best archer I can be. So draw length is the most important. Then maybe it's poundage, maybe it's speed, maybe it's how the valley feels, my holding weight. I want to kind of give an idea of what the level of importance is for me. Maybe it's different on my hunting bow versus my target bow, but draw length is still at the top of that list, okay? So once I put together a bow and I get the draw length right, I get the poundage right, I get the speed right, I'm going to take and I'm going to write down all my specs in a log. Where the axle to axle is, I'm also going to mark my cams. And I'm going to take a little pencil or a silver Sharpie, and I'm going to mark my cam right along the edge of the limb on the inside and outside on both cams. That shows me where the orientation of my cam is, and it also shows me where the synchronization of the two cams are. And the axle to axle is super important as well. So those are really the two things that I look at and measure on a regular basis to know if my strings and cables have crept, if so, how much, and which one crept more. So if I measure my axle to axle length and it's longer than it was in my log, then I know something has crept. Then I'm going to look at my marks and see where my marks are. What if my marks were on the inside of the limb? Well, that would tell me that my string crept, maybe more than my cables. Keep in mind, the strings and cables are never going to get shorter. They're only going to get longer over time as they creep. All right, so I'm going to look at my marks and see where my marks are. I'm going to measure my axle to axle and see where that is so that I can put this bow back and keep it in my spec. Maybe not necessarily where it came from out of the box or from the manufacturer. I might have altered those, making this bow exactly what I wanted it to make it. But I can look at the axle to axle length and I can look at my marks and know what crept and how I get it back to where it was. So let's say synchronization wise, the two marks aren't the same. Well, what I could do is say, again, I'm always going to put twist in the string because, again, it only stretched, right? So what I might do is I'm going to look at my mark. So maybe this mark is slightly on the outside of my limb. Well, I can reach up here and grab this cable right here and kind of pull it down. And I can see by pulling this down, I'm pulling this cam this way. So that would show me that it's this cable that I need to put twist in to shorten it to pull that mark this way. All right. So what I might do is twist this cable until they're the same as my marks, but maybe I look at it and say, well, now they're both on the inside of my limb. Well, that tells me potentially then my string has crept more as well. So then I'm going to come back and put twist in my string until I get my marks back on the edge of my limbs, and my axle to axle should measure properly then. But I'm going to look at those two things, and it's going to tell me real quick if it's moved, how much it's moved, and which one moved more than the other. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you would do me a favor and hit that subscribe button, hit the like button, and leave me a comment, let me know your thoughts. I would greatly appreciate it. It really helps my channel. See you guys in the next one.